Alexander Thompson stood in front of the large mirror in his luxury hotel suite at the Rosewood Hotel. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his black bow tie for the 10th time. The expensive Armani tuxedo fit him perfectly, just like everything else in his carefully planned life. Today was his wedding day, and everything had to be perfect. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the golden cufflinks on his sleeves. A gift from his adoptive father on his first day as CEO of Thompson Investment Partners. At 35, Alexander had everything most people could only dream of. A successful company, a mansion in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, and soon, a beautiful wife from one of the country's oldest families. 10 minutes until the ceremony, Stir called his personal assistant through the door, making Alexander's heart beat faster. He walked to the window and looked down at the hotel's grand garden where workers were putting final touches on the wedding setup. 200 white chairs were arranged in perfect rows. Red roses and white lilies decorated every corner. A string quartet was warming up near the altar. The wedding would cost more than what most people earned in 5 years. The money had never been an issue for Alexander, not since the day the Thompsons adopted him. His mind drifted back to that day, 28 years ago. He had been 7, scared, and alone at the children's home. Eleanor Thompson, with her kind smile and soft voice, had knelt down to his level and said, "Would you like to come home with us, Alexander?" That day had changed everything. The Thompsons had given him their name, their love, and every opportunity money could buy. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out. Eleanor Thompson walked in, looking elegant in her navy blue dress. Even at 65, she carried herself with grace that turned heads. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw him. "Oh, Alexander," she whispered, walking over to straighten his bow tie. "You look so handsome." "Thanks, Mom," he said, smiling at their reflection in the mirror. He was tall and fit, with dark brown hair and unusual amber-colored eyes, a feature from his biological parents that sometimes made him wonder about his past. "Victoria is a lucky girl," Eleanor said, but something in her voice made Alexander turn to look at her. For a moment, he thought he saw worry in her eyes, but it disappeared so quickly he wasn't sure if he had imagined it. "Is everything okay, Mom?" he asked. "Of course, darling," she said quickly, too quickly. "It's just..." Every mother gets emotional on her son's wedding day. She patted his cheek like she used to when he was little. "I just want you to be happy." Alexander smiled confidently. "I am happy. Victoria is perfect. The company is doing better than ever. Everything is exactly as it should be." But even as he said the words, he felt that familiar empty feeling in his chest, the one he usually pushed away with work or expensive distractions. His phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. "Can't wait to be Mrs. Thompson. Love you." Victoria Cambridge, soon to be Victoria Thompson, was everything he had thought he wanted in a wife. She was beautiful, well-educated, and came from the right social circle. Their marriage would be splashed across society magazines, and their families' combined connections would open even more doors for his business. "It's time," Eleanor said softly, holding out her arm. Alexander would walk into the ceremony with her. His adoptive father had passed away 2 years ago. As they walked through the hotel's elegant hallway, staff members bowed and congratulated him. Alexander nodded, barely seeing them. His mind was already at the altar, imagining the perfect moment when Victoria would walk down the aisle in her designer dress. Yet somewhere deep inside, in a place he rarely acknowledged, a small voice whispered that something was missing. Despite all his success, all his money, all his careful planning, there was a hole in his life he couldn't explain. He pushed the thought away, like he always did. This was his perfect day. Nothing could go wrong. Little did Alexander know that fate had other plans, and his perfectly ordered world was about to be turned upside down by a chance encounter that would force him to confront the past he had tried so hard to forget. The wedding ceremony had been perfect. Victoria looked beautiful in her white designer dress as she said, "I do," and the guests clapped when Alexander kissed his bride. Now, the reception was in full swing in the Rosewood Hotel's grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the smell of expensive flowers filled the air. Alexander sat at the main table, feeling proud as he looked at his new wife talking to her friends. He had already had several glasses of champagne, and a pleasant warmth spread through his body. The band played soft music while waiters in black uniforms moved smoothly between tables, serving food and drinks to the 200 guests. "More water, sir," a voice asked from his left. Alexander turned to see a young black waiter holding a water pitcher. The waiter was probably in his early 30s, with a neat uniform and a professional smile. Something about his face caught Alexander's attention. Maybe it was the unusual amber color of his eyes, so similar to Alexander's own. But in his slightly drunk state, Alexander quickly forgot this detail. "Yes," Alexander said shortly, not really looking at the waiter's face anymore. He was busy watching Victoria laugh with her bridesmaids at the next table. The waiter, whose name tag read Marcus Johnson, stepped forward to fill Alexander's glass. But just then, someone bumped into Marcus from behind. The water pitcher tilted, and some water splashed onto the expensive tablecloth near Alexander's plate. A few drops landed on his sleeve. "What the hell?" Alexander stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The champagne in his system made his anger flare quickly. "Look what you've done." Marcus quickly grabbed a cloth from his apron. "I'm very sorry, sir. Let me clean that up right away." But Alexander wasn't listening. All the stress from planning the perfect wedding, all the pressure of maintaining his image, suddenly found a target. "Can't you do your job properly?" he said loudly, making nearby guests turn to look. "This is a high-class event, not some cheap diner." Victoria quickly stood up. "Alexander, it's just water. It's fine." "No, it's not fine." Alexander's voice got even louder. His face was red with anger and alcohol. "I paid a fortune for this wedding. I expect better service than this." He looked at Marcus with cold eyes. "Maybe you should go back to working at fast food restaurants if you can't handle proper service." The ballroom got very quiet. Many guests looked down at their plates, embarrassed by the scene. Others watched with shocked expressions. Eleanor Thompson, sitting nearby, had gone very pale. Marcus stood very straight, still holding his cleaning cloth. His face showed no anger, but his amber eyes held a dignity that made some guests uncomfortable about Alexander's behavior. "Sir," he said calmly, "I apologize again for the accident. If you'll allow me, I'll clean this up and bring you a fresh tablecloth." Something in Marcus's calm voice, and the way he held himself with pride despite Alexander's insults, made Alexander feel a moment of shame. But he was too proud and drunk to back down now. "Just get out of my sight," he snapped, "and send someone else to clean this up." Marcus gave a small professional bow and walked away. As he turned, the light caught his face in a way that made Eleanor Thompson grab the edge of her table. She had seen something in his features that brought back memories from long ago, memories she had tried to keep buried. Victoria touched Alexander's arm. "Honey, sit down, please." Her voice was soft but firm. Alexander sank back into his chair, already feeling embarrassed about his outburst. Around the ballroom, conversations slowly started again, but many people were whispering about what had just happened. "That was unnecessary," Victoria whispered to him. "He was just doing his job, and it was an accident." Alexander loosened his bow tie, suddenly feeling uncomfortable. The happy, floating feeling from the champagne was gone, replaced by a sick feeling in his stomach. He didn't know why he had gotten so angry over something so small. It wasn't like him to lose control like that. What Alexander didn't know was that his outburst had set events in motion that couldn't be stopped. At that very moment, Eleanor Thompson was walking quickly toward the hotel kitchen, her hands shaking as she pulled an old photograph from her small purse. And in the back service area, Marcus Johnson was staring at himself in a small mirror, touching the street Christopher medal he always wore around his neck. The only thing he had from his birth family, given to him before he and his older brother were separated in the foster care system 28 years ago. Eleanor Thompson's hands trembled as she walked through the hotel's busy kitchen. Staff members moved quickly around her, carrying plates and glasses. She barely noticed them. Her eyes searched for one person only, the waiter with the familiar amber eyes that had brought back memories she kept locked away for nearly 3 decades. She found Marcus in the back area, organizing wine glasses on a tray. For a moment, she just watched him work. The way he moved, the shape of his face, even the small dimple that appeared when he concentrated, it was all so familiar. She had seen those same features in another little boy's face many years ago. "Excuse me," Eleanor said softly. "Mr. Johnson?" Marcus turned around, surprised to see one of the wedding guests in the kitchen area. He immediately stood straighter. Yes, ma'am? How can I help you? Eleanor pulled out an old photograph from her purse. Her fingers shook so much she almost dropped it. I need to ask you something, she said. Do you know where you got that Street Christopher medal you're wearing? Marcus's hand automatically went to the silver medal around his neck. His eyes showed confusion and a hint of suspicion. It's from my birth family, he said carefully. I've had it since before I entered foster care, but how did you know about it? It was under my shirt. Because, Eleanor's voice cracked, I watched your mother put it around your neck the day she had to give you up. You were only 3 years old. She held out the photograph. This is you, with your older brother, the day before you were separated. Marcus stared at the photograph. It showed 2 little boys sitting on a worn couch. The older boy, about 7, had his arm around a smaller boy. Both had the same amber eyes. Both wore Street Christopher medals. That's impossible, Marcus whispered, but his hands reached for the photo. The older boy, he looks like Alexander, Eleanor finished quietly. Because he is Alexander, he's your brother. Marcus sat down heavily on a nearby chair. The kitchen noise seemed to fade away as he looked at the photograph. All these years, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I've been trying to find my family. I hired private investigators, searched databases. He looked up at Eleanor. But you knew all this time? Eleanor sat down across from him, tears running down her face. We wanted to adopt you both, she said. My husband and I, but the system wouldn't let us take 2 children. We tried everything, but they had already placed you with another family. She wiped her eyes. We were told it would be better not to maintain contact, that it would confuse you both. It was different back then. What happened to my adoptive family? Marcus asked. Why did I end up back in foster care? They fell on hard times when you were 5, Eleanor explained. By the time we found out you were back in the system, another family was already in the process of fostering you. We were told not to interfere. She reached for his hand. I've kept track of you over the years through private investigators. I knew when you graduated high school, when you started working to put yourself through college. And Alexander? Marcus asked. Does he know about me? Eleanor shook her head. He was so young when it happened. The adoption agency advised us not to tell him, said it might make him feel guilty or confused. As he grew older, it became harder to find the right time. Fresh tears fell from her eyes. But when I saw you today, saw how he treated you, I couldn't keep the secret anymore. Marcus stood up and walked to a small window, trying to process everything. The Street Christopher medal felt heavy against his chest. The man who just yelled at me for spilling water is my brother. My long-lost brother who grew up with all the privileges I never had. Marcus, Eleanor said gently, Alexander isn't a bad person. He's lost his way sometimes, surrounded by all this wealth and pressure to be perfect. But I've seen how empty he feels, even if he won't admit it. She stood up. He needs to know the truth. About you, about his past. Just then, they heard footsteps approaching the kitchen. Eleanor quickly wiped her eyes. Come to the library on the 2nd floor in an hour, she whispered. I'll bring Alexander. It's time for both my boys to know the whole truth. As Eleanor hurried away, Marcus looked down at the photograph again. His finger traced the image of his younger self and the brother he had lost. In less than an hour, their worlds would collide again, but this time, the truth would change everything. Alexander paced back and forth in the hotel's library, his wedding reception continuing without him on the floor below. The room was quiet except for the soft tick of an old clock and his footsteps on the thick carpet. Eleanor had insisted he meet her here, saying it was urgent. He'd seen the serious look in her eyes and knew better than to argue. Mom, what's going on? He asked when Eleanor finally walked in. Victoria's wondering where I am and the guests. He stopped talking when he saw Marcus enter the room behind his mother. What is he doing here? Eleanor closed the heavy wooden door. Sit down, Alexander. Please. Her voice was gentle but firm, the same tone she had used when he was a child and needed to hear something important. I'm not sitting anywhere with him, Alexander said, pointing at Marcus. Did he complain about what happened? Look, I'll pay extra for his trouble, but... This isn't about money, Marcus said quietly. He held the old photograph in his hand but didn't show it yet. This is about something that happened 28 years ago. Alexander looked confused. What are you talking about? Eleanor took a deep breath. Alexander, honey, do you remember anything about your life before we adopted you? About your biological family? Alexander's face went pale. He never talked about his past, never even thought about it if he could help it. Why are you bringing this up now? On my wedding day? Because, Eleanor said, stepping closer to him, there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you long ago. She gently touched his arm. You had a brother, Alexander. A younger brother. The room seemed to spin around Alexander. He grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. What? Marcus stepped forward and held out the photograph. Alexander stared at it, his hands shaking as he took it. Two little boys looked back at him from the faded picture. He recognized himself immediately, the same amber eyes he saw in the mirror every day, and the smaller boy next to him. No, Alexander whispered. He looked up at Marcus, really seeing him for the first time. The same eyes, the same dimple, the same streak Christopher medal. No, this can't be. Your parents loved you both very much, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. But they were struggling terribly. Your father had lost his job, your mother was sick, and they couldn't take care of two young boys. They made the hardest decision any parent could make. Alexander sank into the chair, still staring at the photograph. Memories he had buried long ago started coming back. Playing with toy cars on a worn carpet, helping a smaller boy tie his shoes, promising to always protect him. I remember, he whispered. I remember promising to take care of you. He looked at Marcus, tears filling his eyes. But I forgot. How could I forget? You were just a child, Eleanor said. The adoption agency thought it would be easier for you both to have a clean break. They placed you with us and Marcus with another family. She wiped her eyes. We tried to adopt you both, but they wouldn't let us. Then Marcus's adoptive family had problems, and he went back into foster care. While you grew up in luxury, Marcus said, no anger in his voice, just sadness. I bounced between foster homes. I worked as a dishwasher after school to save money for college. I never stopped looking for my family, but all I had was this medal and some fading memories. Alexander touched his own neck, remembering the identical medal he had taken off years ago and stored in a box somewhere. Shame washed over him as he remembered his behavior at the reception. I treated you. Oh God, I treated my own brother like someone beneath you, Marcus finished. But that's not who you really are, is it? Not the brother I remember who used to read me stories and share his cookies with me. Alexander stood up suddenly and walked to the window. His perfect world was crumbling around him, but somehow it felt right, like a lie being replaced by a difficult but necessary truth. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice rough with emotion. To both of you. Mom, for not being the son you raised me to be. And Marcus. He turned around, tears now flowing freely. My brother, I'm sorry I forgot you. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry for today, for everything. The clock kept ticking softly as three people stood in the library, 28 years of secrets and separation between them, and the long road to healing stretching ahead. The wedding reception continued downstairs, but in the hotel's quiet kitchen area, two brothers stood face to face. Eleanor had left them alone to talk, understanding that they needed this time to deal with their feelings. The night shift had started, and the kitchen was almost empty except for a few workers cleaning up in the distance. Tell me about your life, Alexander said softly, very different from his angry tone earlier. I need to know everything I missed. Marcus leaned against a steel counter, his fingers touching the street Christopher medal around his neck. You sure you want to hear it? It's not a happy story like yours. Please, Alexander said. I owe you that much. Marcus took a deep breath. After my adoptive family gave me up, I went through 6 different foster homes. Some were okay, others. He shook his head. Let's just say I learned to take care of myself early. Started working in restaurant kitchens at 14, washing dishes after school. The kitchen staff became my real family, taught me to cook, helped me with homework, made sure I stayed in school. Alexander's hands gripped the edge of a nearby table. Each word from Marcus felt like a punch to his stomach. While he had been going to private schools and summer camps, His little brother had been struggling just to survive. I got lucky in my last foster home, Marcus continued. My foster mom, Mrs. Rodriguez, she really cared. Helped me apply for scholarships. I got into community college, worked my way through school waiting tables. Got my business degree last year. He smiled slightly. I'm actually starting my own catering company next month. This is my last week working here. A business degree? Catering company? Alexander's voice was full of surprise and pride. That's amazing. Yeah, well, I didn't have a trust fund, Marcus said, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. Had to do it the hard way, but that's not what really bothers me about all this. What do you mean? Marcus stood up straighter, looking directly into his brother's eyes. What bothers me is watching you become exactly what our parents were trying to protect us from. They gave us up because they wanted us to have better lives, not for you to turn into someone who looks down on people who work hard for a living. The words hit Alexander hard. He thought about his behavior at the reception, about all the times he dismissed people he thought were beneath him. I never meant to become this person, he said quietly. Somewhere along the way, trying to prove I deserved everything the Thompsons gave me, I lost myself. Lost yourself? Marcus's voice rose slightly. While you were losing yourself in your mansion and your fancy cars, I was losing sleep wondering if my brother was even alive. Do you know how many Alexander Thompsons I looked up over the years? How many dead ends I hit? And then I finally find you, and you're... He stopped, emotions choking his words. And I'm what? Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. You're everything our parents didn't want us to be, Marcus said sadly. Superficial. Arrogant. Looking down on people who are exactly where we came from. Alexander felt tears forming in his eyes again. You're right, he admitted. God, you're so right. When the Thompsons adopted me, I was so scared they'd change their minds if I wasn't perfect. So I tried to become what I thought they wanted. Successful, powerful, married to the right person. But Mom and Dad, they never asked for that. They just wanted me to be happy. He looked at his brother. And somewhere along the way, I forgot the most important promise I ever made, to take care of my little brother. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. You know what's funny? He finally said. All these years, I kept this medal because it made me feel close to my family. And now I find out my brother doesn't even wear his anymore. Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He quickly pulled up a photo and showed it to Marcus. It was a picture of a wooden box on his bedside table. I keep it right there, he said softly. Every night before bed, I touch it and feel like something's missing. I never knew what until now. The brothers stood in silence, years of pain and loss hanging between them. But in that silence, something else was growing. A chance for healing, for redemption, for becoming the men their parents had hoped they would be. Victoria found her new husband sitting alone in their honeymoon suite, his bow tie undone and his eyes red from crying. The sounds of the reception still drifted up from downstairs, but Alexander hadn't returned to their guests. She had covered for him, telling everyone he had an important phone call, but she knew something bigger was happening. Eleanor told me everything, Victoria said softly, closing the door behind her. She sat down next to Alexander on the edge of the bed, still wearing her wedding dress. About Marcus. About your past. Alexander didn't look at her. I guess you're having second thoughts about marrying me now, he said bitterly. Finding out your husband isn't really from old money after all, that he's just some kid from... Stop, Victoria interrupted, taking his hand. Do you really think that's why I married you, for your background? When Alexander didn't answer, she continued, I married you because behind all that business success and social status, I saw someone who was hurting. Someone looking for something he couldn't find in his perfect life. Alexander finally looked at her, surprised. You knew? Victoria smiled gently. I saw how you would get quiet sometimes, staring at nothing. How you kept that medal in the box by your bed, but never talked about it. I knew there was more to your story. She squeezed his hand. I just didn't know what it was until now. I treated him so badly, Alexander whispered, fresh tears falling. My own brother. If you had seen his face when he told me about his life. While I was going to private schools, he was washing dishes to survive. While I was buying sports cars, he was working his way through college. He stood up and walked to the window. What kind of person does that make me? It makes you human, Victoria said. Someone who made mistakes, yes, but someone who can also make things right. Alexander turned to face her. How? How do I make up for 28 years of not being there? For becoming exactly the kind of person our parents were trying to protect us from? Victoria stood up, her wedding dress rustling as she walked at him. You start by being honest. With Marcus. With yourself. Stop trying to be this perfect version of Alexander Thompson that you think everyone expects. She touched his face gently. Be the brother who used to read stories to Marcus. Be the man I fell in love with, the one who cries at sad movies but tries to hide it, who secretly gives large tips to struggling waiters when he thinks no one is looking. You noticed that? Alexander asked, surprised again. Of course I did. That's the real you, Alexander. Not the man who yelled at a waiter today. She paused. Tell me about little Alexander, the one who took care of his brother. Alexander's voice grew soft as memories flooded back. I used to save half my cookies for him. Even when I was hungry, I saved them. He was so little, you know. Mom, our birth mom, she was sick a lot, and Dad was always looking for work. So I would tell Marcus stories, make up adventures about brave knights who protected their families. His voice broke. I promised him I'd always protect him, but instead, I became someone he needed protection from. Victoria wrapped her arms around him, then become someone different. It's not too late. Marcus is starting a catering company. You have business experience, connections. You can help him, be the big brother he needed all these years. What if he doesn't want my help? Alexander asked. What if it's too late? The fact that he's still here, that he told you his story instead of just walking away, that means something, Victoria said. He wants his brother back too. She stepped back and straightened his collar, just like she would do many times in the years to come. Now, are you going to hide up here feeling sorry for yourself, or are you going to go find your brother and start making things right? Alexander looked at his new wife with gratitude and love. She wasn't just the society bride everyone saw. She was his bridge to becoming a better man. What did I do to deserve you? He asked softly. Victoria smiled. You were yourself, beneath all that perfect facade. Now go be that person for your brother too. Alexander nodded, straightened his shoulders, and headed for the door. It was time to stop hiding from his past and start building a new future, one that included his brother. The reconciliation. 2 weeks after the wedding, Marcus stood outside a small cafe, checking his watch. Alexander had asked to meet him here, away from the fancy restaurants and luxury hotels that made up his usual world. The morning sun was warm, and people hurried past on their way to work. Marcus almost didn't come. The past 2 weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions, anger, hope, fear, and confusion all mixed together. But something made him show up, maybe the same feeling that had made him keep that street Christopher medal all these years. He saw Alexander walking toward him, dressed differently than at the wedding. Instead of an expensive suit, he wore simple jeans and a blue shirt. He carried a large brown envelope under his arm. Thanks for coming, Alexander said when he reached Marcus. His voice was nervous, unsure, very different from the confident businessman Marcus had first met. They went inside and found a quiet table in the corner. After ordering coffee, an awkward silence fell between them. I brought something, Alexander finally said, opening the envelope. He pulled out an old photo album. Mom, Eleanor. She kept these all these years. Photos of us, before. His voice trailed off. Marcus's hands shook slightly as he took the album. The first photo showed 2 little boys playing with toy cars. I remembered these, he said softly. The red car was mine. You always let me have the red one because it was my favorite. Alexander smiled sadly. You used to make the engine sounds, really loud ones. It drove Mom crazy, our birth mom, I mean. They spent the next hour looking through photos, each picture bringing back memories they thought were lost forever. A birthday party with a homemade cake, a Christmas morning with simple presents wrapped in newspaper. 2 little boys swimming in a public pool, their street Christopher medals glinting in the sun. I found mine, Alexander said suddenly, pulling his medal from his pocket. It was identical to the one Marcus wore. I'm going to start wearing it again. If that's okay with you. Marcus nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then he pulled out his own envelope and placed it on the table. I brought something too. My business plan for the catering company. Alexander looked surprised. You want me to see it? Victoria came to see me yesterday, Marcus explained. She said you might be able to help. Not with money, he added quickly, seeing Alexander's expression, but with advice, experience. You built a successful company. I'm just starting out. Alexander picked up the business plan with respect, handling it carefully like it was precious. You did all this while working full-time? Nights, weekends. Mrs. Rodriguez, my last foster mom. She helped me run the numbers, her sisters letting me use her industrial kitchen to start. Marcus watched his brother read through the pages. I want to do this right. Build something real. Alexander looked up, his eyes bright. This is good, Marcus. Really good. The concept, the marketing plan. He paused. But you're thinking too small. With your talent and experience, you could target bigger events, corporate clients. For the next 2 hours, they talked business. Alexander pointed out opportunities Marcus hadn't considered, while Marcus explained the realities of the catering world that Alexander had never thought about. They ordered more coffee, then lunch, barely noticing the time passing. Finally, Marcus sat back in his chair. Why are you helping me? After everything. Because I'm your brother, Alexander said simply. And because you earned this. Every bit of it. The hard way. He hesitated. I know I can't make up for the past, but maybe I can be here for the future. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor wants us both over for dinner next Sunday, he said finally. She's making Mom's old recipe for meatloaf. The one you used to sneak me extra pieces of when I was little. You remember that? Alexander asked, surprised. I remember everything, Marcus said. The good and the bad. And maybe it's time to make some new memories. Alexander touched the metal in his pocket, feeling its familiar shape. I'd like that, he said softly. As they walked out of the cafe, the brothers still had a long way to go. Years of separation couldn't be fixed in one morning, but they had taken the first steps on a new path, one they would walk together this time, the new beginning. 6 months had passed since the wedding day that changed everything. The grand ballroom of the Thompson Hotel was filled with people again, but this time for a different occasion, the launch of Brothers Catering and Events, Marcus and Alexander's joint venture. Marcus stood at the center of the room, wearing a crisp chef's jacket with the company's logo, 2 Street Christopher medals intertwined. He was directing his staff as they served sample dishes to potential clients. The menu was a creative mix of high-end cuisine and comfort food, just like the brothers themselves. Alexander watched from near the entrance, his own medal now proudly visible around his neck. Victoria stood beside him, her hand resting on her slightly rounded belly. Their first child was due in 6 months. Look at him, Alexander said proudly, watching Marcus charm a group of corporate executives. He's a natural at this. Just like his brother. Victoria smiled, squeezing his hand. Though you've changed too, you know. She was right. The past 6 months had transformed Alexander. He had stepped back from some of his high society commitments to spend more time with his brother. Every Sunday, both brothers went to Eleanor's house for family dinner, slowly rebuilding the bonds that time had broken. Eleanor walked up to them, her eyes shining with tears of joy. Your parents would be so proud, she said softly. Both of them, your birth parents and your father. Alexander hugged her. They'd be proud of you too, Mom. For keeping our family story alive, for never giving up on either of us. Across the room, Marcus was unveiling their signature dish, a gourmet version of the meatloaf their birth mother used to make. The recipe had come from Mrs. Rodriguez, Marcus's foster mother, who now worked as a consultant for their company. She and Eleanor had become close friends, 2 mothers who had helped shape the brothers' lives in different ways. Mr. Thompson, a young waiter, approached Alexander nervously. The press is here for the interview. Alexander smiled kindly at the waiter. He never spoke harshly to service staff anymore. Thank you, and please call me Alexander. He turned to Victoria, ready to help me tell our story. But before they could move, Marcus called out to the crowd. Could I have everyone's attention, please? The room fell quiet. Today isn't just about launching a business. It's about something much more important, family. He gestured for Alexander to join him. As the brothers stood side by side, their matching amber eyes and medals gleaming under the lights, Many guests noticed their resemblance for the first time. 6 months ago, I was working as a waiter at my brother's wedding, Marcus continued. I didn't know he was my brother then, and he didn't know I existed. Life had separated us, but fate brought us back together. And now, he looked at Alexander with a smile. Now we're building something together. Something that honors where we came from and celebrates where we're going. Alexander stepped forward. Our company isn't just about food. It's about bringing people together, creating moments that matter. Every event we cater, every meal we serve, carries the love of two families. The one that had to let us go, and the ones that helped us find our way back to each other. Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her sons. The press photographers were snapping pictures, but she saw something they couldn't capture, the healing of a wound that had been open for 28 years. Later that evening, after the guests had left, the brothers stood together on the hotel's rooftop terrace. The city lights sparkled below them like stars. Did you ever imagine this? Marcus asked, holding up his glass. Us, here, doing this together. Alexander shook his head. I spent so many years trying to be perfect, trying to belong in this world of wealth and privilege. But I never felt complete. He touched his medal. Now I know why. We can't change the past, Marcus said. But maybe we can help other families stay together. He smiled at his brother. The foundation launches next month. Eleanor's already found 3 sibling groups we can help. Alexander nodded. They had created the Thompson Brothers Foundation to help foster children and support families in crisis. It was their way of honoring their parents' sacrifice and ensuring other children wouldn't face the same separation they had. As the brothers stood there, their medals catching the last light of day, they knew their story wasn't just about reconciliation. It was about redemption, about turning pain into purpose, about proving that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be.